Welcome back to Mark and Garrett's Performance Show. Today I'm going to show y'all how to correctly set mechanical lifters. I have had so many customers that after they get their engines and they break them in and they run them a couple of nights and then they won't run very good and I ask them to check the valves and they don't know how. And I end up having to go do it and they just don't get it because I confuse them. So there's lots of people that will tell you lots of different ways to do this, and some people will tell you can rotate the engine over 2 or 3 times and do it and get one cylinder. That's wrong. All of that is wrong. The correct way to do it is 1 cylinder at a time, and it takes longer that way, but hey, if you're looking for horsepower, I mean, you do it how you want to, but if you do it the way I'm telling you, it is the right way. Now, if you don't believe me, ask some of the guys that, I had a customer last week that called me in brand new engine, and I let him set his own valves and it wouldn't run, and he was pissed off because it wouldn't pull off the corner and this and that, and then I went and set the valves for him and now all of a sudden it runs great. So alright, and here's the thing. The first thing you need to know is to set the valves correctly, you have to be on the base circle of the camshaft. And the way you know you're on the base circle of the camshaft, I'm going to explain it to you. If you're setting the exhaust valve, then you need to rotate the engine over until the intake valve for that cylinder moves all the way open and starts to close, about midway between closed and starting to close. So we're going to do that right now. Garrett's going to, we'll get a close up of, this is intake valve, this is exhaust valve. We're setting the exhaust valve. All right, now we're going to rotate the engine over. Exhaust valve is going to obviously open. Okay, now the intake valve starting to open, 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 open. Now it's starting to close just about right there. Now, the other mistake everybody makes, over here, is they always get the damn things too tight because they don't want to take the time to actually check it and get them right. Roller rockers, especially cheap roller rockers, sometimes the tip of the rocker is not concentric. It's not drilled concentric. So sometimes the rockers might be a little tighter on one side of the roller than it is on the other. If you get a set of rockers that way, it's better to set the rocker on the tightest side of that roller. That way the valve will not tighten up. Normally they will they'll kind of find their spot and they'll stay there on the low side, but I'd rather have the valve have a little bit of extra clearance because it's never more than 1/1000. I'd rather them be there than be too tight. So what you want to do, and the way I do it, if I'm setting them for the first time, I just run it down until it's zeroed out. Okay, and then what I do is I back it off a couple of turns, so we're pretty close, and then I run the polylock down, or if you're using a nut, just run it down until you just touch. Now here's where it gets intricate, because you need, bring the camera over here so you can get a shot from this side, Garrett. What you need to do, what you're trying to do, and what everybody does is they set them, and as long as they can shove that thing under there, well, I'm telling you, I can twist that thing down a half a turn and still shove that, well, I can't there, but like right there, that's too tight. I can roll it in, but it's too tight. All right, so the correct way to do it is to hold the feeler gauge flat on top of the valve, stem, and tighten your polylock or your nut until you just feel it. You'll feel it touch. Then what you need to do is, or what I do, is I hold the rocker straight with my fingers and I wiggle it back and forth, because especially if you're using these, if you're using regular roller rockers, then you don't have to do this, but you can just kind of pick them up and move them around. But you want that feeler gauge to be able to slide in from the side, holding that rocker up with just a little bit of drag on it, and I mean just a little bit. If you don't have a little drag, it's too loose. You need to tighten it up. That was a little too loose. Now we have just a little drag on that rocker. Now, if you're holding it straight, now if you cock it to one side, it tightens up. If you cock it to the other side, it tightens up. You hold it right in the center, it's got just a little drag. That is correct lash adjustment. The other thing is you really need to have the engine hot when you do it. But when you're building them on the stand, you got to set them somewhere. So normally what I do is I set them where they are. I tell the customer to run it in and then check it. And half the time they don't, and I have to go set them for them. So, all right. Now we've done the exhaust valve. I've got the wrong polylocks on this thing, but I will show you. After you put your polylock in, the other mistake everybody makes is they tighten these polylocks up, and once they get them tight, they don't check them again. You have to check them again. Like, okay, now I've got this polylock tight. You don't have to, when you're tightening a polylock, you know, you want it tight, but you do not have to break the damn Allen wrench trying to get it tight. It's not going anywhere. If you've got it tight, it will jam and it's locked. All right. Now, I will go back and check this rocker. Now, I'm way too loose. Okay? This is where everybody makes a mistake. Because sometimes they'll tighten up and sometimes they'll loosen up. But now we're way too loose. So, and all that is just for me tightening that polylock. So, what I'll do is, you've just got to guesstimate it. And you get it back in there, and now we know it's going to loosen up, so you tighten it up a little more so it's a little tighter, and then we set our tighten our polylock up. If it tightens up when you tighten the polylock, especially when you're using stud girdles, they'll go all over the place. So you've got to check them after you put a stud girdle on there and readjust them. So now I'm going to tighten this up. And now we're perfect. Well, we're still a little tight. Okay, now that valve is perfect. No, it doesn't. It's not fast. It doesn't take it's not a 5-minute job to set them correctly. You're going to have to pay attention. All right, now we're going to move on to the intake valve. Now, like I said, to set the exhaust valve, you let the intake valve for that cylinder open all the way up and start to close. But to set the intake valve, you rotate the engine around till the exhaust valve just starts to open. As long as it's open, just open a little bit. Between just opening in mid lift, right in that area. Don't let it break over to the other side. You're fine. So we're going to rotate the engine over. Now, the exhaust valve is just starting to open. Now we set our intake valve. Same thing. I'm going to run this down to 0. If they're already on the car and the engine's already running, you don't have to do all this. You can skip this part of it, but you'll have to loosen them up and whatever. But all right, we know that last one, it tightened or it loosened up, so I'm gonna set this one a little tighter before I put the polylock in it. I put the jam bolt in it. Like I said, these are not the right polylocks. I'm just using this for example. So tighten him up, and now we check it again, and now we're perfect. Like I said, you want it to where there's just a little bit of drag, holding that feeler gauge flat on top of the valve. Wiggle it and you'll find its sweet spot. If you cock it to one side, it locks up. You cock it to the other side, it locks up. And then right in the middle, it's just very, very little drag. And I'm not talking about having to shove it in there. It's just very little drag. You do that, your rocker's set. Now, the other mistake everybody makes is when they get a brand new engine, they'll run it in and they won't check the valve lash. Well, you've got to think that everything is breaking in. The valves will settle a little. They can tighten up, they can loosen up. The cam wears, the valves settle in. You have to check it, especially after you run it. Like if it's a race engine, if it's a drag race engine, after you make the first couple passes with it, you need to check the valves. After that, you don't have to check them as often. Maybe check them once a week, once a weekend, maybe every other weekend. A dirt motor, you really need to check them after every race night. Most people won't, though. They won't do it. But if you do that, your engine will run a whole lot better. Now, here's some other things. Tightening the valves up is a bad thing. You know, if some people will say, well, you can sometimes, well, you can get away with a few thousandths, but like I've heard of guys wanting to tighten them up as much as 5 thousandths. Don't do that. The camshaft's not designed for that. It's really hard on them. If you feel you need, you know, if you need to get rid of a little burst, like a little power burst, you can give them a couple thousandths tightened up, and it'll kind of soften up that burst off the line, if you will, or out of the corner if you're burning the tires off. If you need a little extra off the corner, you can back them off a couple of thousandths, but I would not go more than about 3 thousandths backing them off on any camshaft. And that's just my opinion, and it's my experience. But there again, that's a very general thing I'm telling you there, because every camshaft is different. You know, so right now we're talking about solid flat tappet cams or solid roller cam. This is how you set the valves. If you're doing a hydraulic, that's a completely different situation. You still put the valves in the same spot with the intake valve closing to set the exhaust, and the exhaust valve opening, exhaust valve just starting to open to set the intake. You do that the same way, but there's no lash. You take the lash out, and everybody has their preference. I personally like to, depending on the cam and whatever, and the lifter I'm using, most of the time on a hydraulic cam, if I'm using a heavy duty lifter, which I use a lot, I don't use any anti-pump ups, I don't use any of that shit. I use just regular old heavy duty lifters, and I usually just set them and I give them a quarter of a turn off of zero, which means you bring all this lash together, you know, just like before, and give it a quarter of a turn. That'll usually center the plunger or get the plunger pretty close to where it needs to be. Some people give them a half, you can do that, but I give them a quarter. That's just what I do. Now, if you're using a VMAX lifter or a special lifter like that, then you want to set it like Rhodes tells you to set it. But I don't like VMAX lifters. I hate them. I do like Comp's zero tolerance lifter, but it's not an anti-pump up. It's a real tight lifter, and it doesn't bleed down. I don't like any sort of anti-pump, or I don't like any sort of bleed down lifter, because believe it or not, they can actually make your car soggier off the corner because it actually backs the cam timing up, theoretically. And I've had issues with that, and I don't use them. So the thing to do is to use the right camshaft for the job. And now I'm a comp man, I'm a competition cams man. I work with them, I talk to their cam guys every day, their engineers, and they're pretty much on top of their game, and they will not steer you wrong, and if they do, they will make it right. They'll fix it. But there's also other good cam companies out there too. I'm not knocking any of them. I'm just saying you need to work with your cam guy on the right camshaft for your engine, so that you're not having to do a bunch of crazy stuff to the valve train to make it work. All that being said, I guess that's pretty much it for the Mark and Garrett show. You got anything else, Garrett? Nope.
That's it.
All right, then. See you next time.